So, hello, London. How are you all doing today? So, we're going to go back to South Africa, 1983, where a 11-year-old boy got his first computer. It was a Spectral video computer, and we can just imagine that the first lines of code that he ever wrote when he started up the computer, so that Microsoft Advanced Basic thing coming up was something along the lines of this. So this was a Spectral Video SVI 318 computer with a chiclet-style keyboard. That's sort of a rubbery keyboard that is really terrible to write on. It had sort of some keypads onto the left, and it came with a little plastic thing you could pop in, and it became a gaming machine. So, but it didn't have any games. So, as you had at the time, you had to write your own games, and within a year's time, he sat down and wrote something like this. I want you to keep attention to his very economical use of white space in this. There is virtually none. But he wrote this, sent it into a South African computing magazine called PC and Office Technology. This came on print there in December 1984. And believe it or not, having things on print, source code on print that you had to type into your own computer was a fairly common way of distributing software back in 1984. And when you typed in all of this, got to the end and wrote run, you would see this game. Blaster, written by a 12-year-old called Elon Musk. So the game itself looks fairly familiar. There's a spaceship that you can control around. There are some aliens attacking. You have something called status beams that seem to be really dangerous. I don't know what they are. But Elon Musk said in 2019 that he probably wouldn't have started programming if it hadn't been for video games and computers. And he wouldn't have been as interested in technology, and that getting kids interested in programming has way bigger knock-on effects that you may imagine. And with Elon Musk, at the verge of his teenage years, I think it's a very good place to start this story about the marvels of teenage engineering. So during the next 50 minutes, we're going to go around the world, meet lots of kids in their bedrooms doing incredible things with computers, and we are going to start in the Soviet Union. So this is a Electronica 60 computer. It was a Soviet computer made by Electronica Voronezh in the 80s. It's actually a Western computer. It's known in the Western world as the PDP-11, but this was a Soviet clone, and it was the computer that the original Tetris was created on. It's a fairly good computer. It's a 16-bit computer with 64 kilobytes of memory, and Alexei Plateau, this guy, wrote Tetris on it. Obviously not a teenager. He was 29 at the time when Tetris was created. So let me introduce you to another guy. This is Vadim Garassimo. And he was 16 at the time this photo was taken, when Tetris came out. Vadim was a student at Arkady Borovsky, which was a local high school, and he was studying maths and computer science. And together with his science teacher, he was working on creating an encryption program for MS-DOS back in 1986, which is a fairly advanced thing for a 16-year-old to be doing. At that time, he was discovered by the creators of Tetris. And he knew how to program sort of Western MS-DOS computers, so he was shown some source code for some of the games that they had been making, and he came back the day after with a MS-DOS port of this. So he got enough trust to get cracking on Tetris. So he created the MS-DOS version of Tetris. He also introduced the colored blocks and everything that we know to be iconic in Tetris. And if it hadn't been for Vadim knowing how to program these things, Tetris might not have made it through the Iron Curtain and have become the legend it is today. So thank you, Vadim, for doing this. So that's a good hate it when this happens, when you get that ransomware in the middle of a presentation. Today, these things are fairly serious. around the beginning of the 90s, it was a bit more fun. So let me introduce you to Neil McAllister from San Francisco. He was a 17-year-old punk. His favorite pastime was going around blowing up public phone booths using firecrackers. But he also had an IBM XT clone in his bedroom. And he had this one with a modem connected to it. So he used to phone up something called built-in board systems. Now, those were the social media of the time. There were computers at other people's houses which you could ring up and exchange messages on bulletin boards, chat with other people, get pirated software and all that. And one of the things that he really disliked was sort of these elitist hackers hanging around on the bulletin boards, bragging about the computer viruses they created. And one computer virus that was making a bit of fuss at the time was a virus by Dr. Teresa Goody called the AIDS virus. And this was late 80s. That was a terrible name for a computer virus. This was at the height of the AIDS pandemic or epidemic, and there was no cure at the time. So today you can live with AIDS and have a fairly good life. You couldn't at the time; it was a death sentence. So he thought that was a terrible virus. It was written in Turbo Pascal. It was huge. It weighed in at 16 kilobytes. So he wanted to create his own virus. Named after his favorite band, Death, and their album Leprosy. You can see the cover on the left-hand side there. Just one problem, though. He didn't know how to program. But he had ideas for this. He wanted this to be 666 bytes big, being influenced by sort of a few occult things. And so he got about teaching himself programming. And when you ran this thing, nothing happened. But whenever the date came to any Friday the 25th, something strange would happen. So it will hang around on your computer, and when you get to Friday the 25th, this popped up. And if you try turning it off and on again, it's still stuck around. So how did he manage? Well, first of all, he got the Peter Norton Pink Shirt book, which was sort of the Bible for programming IBM PC computers at the time. And he taught himself programming reading that. But that didn't teach him how to get things down to 666 bytes. But he picked up a copy of 1989 copy of PC Magazine. It had an article on how to write a very, very simple bootstrapper for C-based programs that did away with all the argument handling and things that we do today whenever we create sort of terminal applications. And he sat down and wrote this. And this is the actual source code. And you can see here, down here is sort of the code that finds the healthy files and infects them when it's virus and keeps on going. And there were a few good things in there. As you do when you distribute something that is open source, you write documentation for this one. So this is the official documentation for the leprosy virus. And he uploaded this to the bulletin board systems and distributed it there. Now, of course, when you distribute a virus that way, it's going to be known within a few hours, and all the antiviral software got to this, so it didn't become a huge epidemic. Now, there were a few things that he weren't that satisfied with. The one thing was that he didn't get it down to 666 bytes. So he went on, taught himself assembler programming. And then he sort of did a second strain of the virus, the Leprosy 2, that was 666 bytes. Wrote documentation again, uploaded it, and forgot everything about it. Until sort of an underground fanzine called 40 Hex, in its first ever issue, had a feature on the leprosy second strain. And this was a fanzine for people making computer viruses. And it turned out that his techniques for creating the second strain were the new gold standard of creating good computer viruses that would really infect. So you could say that him hanging around at the bulletin board systems and social media of the time really made his viruses go viral without him intending for that to happen.
Now on sale, its disk drive building.
In the design phase.
WISN-TV, Milwaukee. This is Channel 12 Action News.
The FBI this afternoon confirmed it is investigating members of a Milwaukee area computer club.
Having successfully tapped in to the computer of the Nuclear Weapons Research Laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico.
Milwaukee man under investigation reportedly said breaking into the computer system was, quote, really easy to do.
How easy was it? Very, very easy.
So let me introduce you to a couple of kids from Milwaukee. So this was Timothy Winslow and Gerald Madera. And together with an older boy, they made up the 411s, which was a computer club they had. And they had met at Explorer Scouts, which was sort of a thing they had in Milwaukee, which were scouts who, instead of exploring nature and wildlife, they explored technology and computers. So they met up there, and they took their name, the 411s, from the Milwaukee area code. And their inspiration for that was that the street gangs in Milwaukee used the street numbers for the names. So you had the 7s and the 9s doing sort of whatever they did there. And so they wanted to be a bit naughty, the 411s. And inspired by the film War Games, which had come out early that year, which sort of introduced the world to sort of the hacking scene and everything, they sat down and did exactly the same thing that happened in the film. So they wrote a program that dialed up every single phone number in the phone book during night, and just to see if there was a computer at the other end. And wherever there was, they made a list, and then the day after they started dialing them up and seeing if there was something they could log into. And lo and behold, there was. There were so many places that they managed to log into. So they managed to log into a cancer center and delete some patients' records. Whoops. A cement factory, there was a taxidermy company, there was a rubber plant, loads of things, but nothing really happened until they found the Los Alamos nuclear research facility that belonged to the American military. So they logged in there, didn't manage to do much damage, but suddenly loads of strange things started happening. They started hearing these clicking noises on the phone lines, and one fine morning the FBI raided the houses. Now these boys were 15, 16 years old, and the police were really unsure if they'd have done anything in particularly wrong. And it turned out they hadn't, because the United States did not have any laws against computer crimes at the time. So they were charged with minor misdemeanors. They were fined for making prank phone calls, and basically got away with it. A year later, the United States got their first sort of computer crime laws, and that was mostly due to the 411s and them trying to copy the things they had seen on the movie screen in War Games a bit earlier that year. So, fairly nice story, that. So this might look a bit familiar to you. This is a game that is called Dangerous Dave in Copyright Infringement. It actually is. And Dangerous Dave was a series of games made by someone called John Romero. And he wanted to get a license from Nintendo to create a PC version of the Super Mario games. And he had just met up with a young programmer called John Carmack, who was 17 years old at the time, who during a weekend programmed this. And they sent this off to Nintendo to try to get the license. Nintendo weren't that interested in creating games for the PC. They were, after all, in the business of selling their own hardware and cartridges for that. But John Romero wouldn't let this go. So he started something, but before we can tell that story, we have to speak a bit about how games were made at the time. So you had something called sprites, and that was what you would build the world from, which were like little blocks, for example, 48 by 48 pixels big, and you would sort of spread this out and create a world from it. So you would draw your picture from this little puzzle parts, and that would be your background. For anyone working with web technologies, this might seem familiar. It's basically sees as sprites these days. So this is where that comes from. But John Carmack is credited with inventing something very important in the games industry in relation to this, and that's a technique called adaptive tile refresh. And this is John Carmack's 17-year-old original source code for this. Everything of the magic sort of happens around here. And this is a story that everyone tells you about, the sort of the young genius of John Carmack. There is another thing with this that Wikipedia doesn't tell you, but which is equally important to the story. And that's a discovery he made about the extended graphics adapter for the IBM PC that had just come out. So if you think about your screen and the viewport that you see something on screen, this is the thing, and then you have sort of things off to the left hand and the right hand side of what you actually see. And he discovered that you could increase the screen size beyond what was shown. And that enabled him to sort of draw little blocks of these sprites off the left hand and the right hand side of your screen. And then he figured out that you could manipulate sort of where this computer started drawing the screen to make this smoothly scroll sideways, which had never been done before on a PC computer. And no one tells that story except for the Guinness Book of Records. So in the 1991 Guinness Book of Records, ID Software, which later would become famous for creating Doom and a few other games, were credited for Commander Keen in the Invasion of the Watercons for creating the first ever smooth-scrolling PC game. And that sort of gave them the bragging rights to have advertisement which said that, and it makes an IBM outshine an Amiga. For those of you who do not know what an Amiga is, this was one of the sort of legendary late 80s computers, and there were two at the time. The Amiga is on the Commodore Amiga on the left-hand side here, and you had the Atari ST. Both computers that were built around the Motorola 68000 processor, but they were fairly different. So the Atari was the cheap version of this, and the Amiga was sort of the better one. Vastly superior, and we can see that in the 1989 game by Psygnosis called Shadow of the Beast. So this is the same game, side by side on the two different computers, and you can see the difference and how much better this looks on the Amiga than the Atari ST. The Atari ST one was so bad that it didn't even feature music. They couldn't do music in it. That's why I can play this on top of each other and it still sounds good, with sound effects from both of them. So how come that 1 year later, Swedish 17-year-old Nicholas Tissot goes on and creates this game for the Atari ST? You can start counting, but there are way more than the 16 colors that the Atari ST was able of showing on screen here, and it's moving perfectly smooth, sideways scrolling with lots of layers and details to it. So this was supposed to be impossible, but this 17-year-old boy managed to pull it off. And before we can talk about how we actually managed to pull that off, we have to talk about the two options of screens you could buy with your Atari computer. You had the option of getting the black and white high resolution one, or you could get the lower resolution color screen. And the lower resolution color screen had a refresh rate of 50 hertz here in Europe. If you went to the States, it was 60, and that's because of the electricity grids operating at different switching rates at the two continents. If you could change your refresh rate to 60 here in Europe as well, that would stretch the image, as we just saw. And this has to do with some vintage pieces of technology. So, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between, welcome to the School of Teenage Engineering, and today's lesson on vintage technology. So, this here is a cathode ray tube or a television set. You might have seen one of these at your parents' house or your grandparents or somewhere. This is something that you used to have in your living room to look at for entertainment purposes. And you had something that was an actual ray gun in your living room pointed towards you and firing beams at you. So the ray gun is on the left-hand side here, and the beam is fired towards a fluorescent screen at the under end. then you have sort of really, really super strong magnets in this that are able to bend the beam and control where it hits the fluorescent screen so that the image is drawn from the upper left-hand corner onwards to the right and all the way down to sort of create an image. So that's the way a television worked back in the day. This is an important part of information for what is up next. So this is a bunch of teenagers from Stockholm, Sweden. They had a computer club that went by the name of the Care Bears. And this boy in the red circle was Nicholas Tissot. And he figured out how to do something rather magical. He was the one who wrote the game we saw earlier. And the next bit will be a bit difficult to follow along, but don't worry. It took a 16, 17-year-old kid without any internet access or anything and no Stack Overflow to look up to figure out how to do this. So no worries. So a bit of assembly programming for the Motorola 68000, and keep attention to the red line down there, because the Atari ST was so bad that it couldn't fill the entire screen with an image, so he had this black frame around it. But what he realized was that if you switch to the black and white mode and then back to 50 Hertz color, at the exact right time, you would open up the left-hand border and get more real estate on the screen. And then if you kept this synchronized as long as the sort of horizontal beam moved along the screen, drawing the image line by line, and kept on switching this between the different modes, you could also open up the right-hand side. And he knew that it took exactly 520 clock cycles for the beam to go from the left-hand side to the right-hand side and start on the next line. And if you just kept track of which operations you used and how long they took, you could sort of go on and create a list of things that you could, when you got to the end, just look up the next thing to do. You had this list of all the different variations you could do of this. And the numbers on the right-hand side here is the offsets that you can combine this. Now keep on doing this for 5 to 7 lines as it draws the screen, and you will be able to offset the place the computer starts drawing the screen enough to do smooth side scrolling. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? So, to summarize, what 17-year-old Nicholas Tissot figured out how to do was to do software-based hardware screen scrolling on a computer with no dedicated graphics hardware. Let's do that again. Software-based hardware screen scrolling on a computer with no graphics hardware. That was supposed to be impossible, but he figured it out, which is fairly amazing. So, you guys up for some extra bonus content, especially for the UK?
I have one question. How do you do the colors? You also have like higher color.
The colors. Let's talk about that a bit later. Okay, if we have time at the end, we'll do the colors. So, local bonus content. Because here, just west end of London, there was a gang of even younger people working on this Atari ST computer who called themselves the Lost Boys. And during the summer of 1989, they had sort of the sort of Twitter debate of the time. You know how people were, graphic violence on the screen at the time. But they had a fax war, so they were sending each other insults on telefax, sort of drawing on the paper, sending it over, and then back again. Sort of as the ultimate insult in that, the Lost Boys created this, where they sort of had, I think it's a hedge trimmer towards a Care Bear, and that was sort of the end of this. And that was the first thing in something that these boys created. And these were a couple of boys, 15, 16 years old, a couple of brothers from somewhere in West London, the Kensington area. And they created this. So on that computer not capable of doing anything, they managed to do fairly good 3D graphics. And he instantly got hired to start working in the games industry. That's Tim Moss, the boy behind this, and the photos there in the circle. And as a consequence, he got a job creating computer games. This is the game created by the Moss brothers, 1989. It's called Prehistoric Tale. Sort of a platform puzzler, but it's a fairly good one, and rather impressive. It's made by a 16-year-old. So, let's go even further back in time.
Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll.
So to August 1st, 1981, and the day MTV launched. Now, MTV used to be a big thing, and it had loads of impact on popular culture. Once upon a time, it also showed music, not only reality shows. And the longest running and most popular show ever on MTV was the Party Zone. This launched in 1998, and it went on from midnight until 3 in the morning. After that, the Chill Out song came on, and it was time to come down. And they used to show this. So it was like banging techno music and psychedelic videos. And that inspired some people from back home where I'm from, in Norway, a group of kids called themselves the Spaceballs, who created this in 1992. So it was sort of a music video that they programmed on their Amiga computer. And it had loads of the things that people were used to seeing on the Party Zone on MTV. At the time, this was very impressive because you had all of the moving images and you did not really have any memory to store video or anything like that as we have now. So they created this. Made a big impact, and what as always happens when you make an impact is that people are curious of what are they going to do next. So let me introduce you to Paul Endre Anderson. This is the 15-year-old boy who programmed what we just saw, and this is his girlfriend at the time, another friend of hers, and this is the actual production video from what they came up with. So they went out to in front of a white wall at the local school and filmed the girls dancing. One of these girls was a Norwegian disco dancing champion at the time, so she was fairly good. And Paul Endre then took this video home and created this. Now, we have to remember that this was the early 1990s, so digital video equipment was something that only sort of broadcasters like the BBC had. So Paul Endre Anderson created his own hardware to digitize the video and then digitize it into these vector graphics here, because he had no memory to store actual video. So he created this, came up with all of the algorithms for doing this himself, and did a follow-up to this one. Now this is going to be important a bit further down the road, but first let me introduce you to Dillon Cuthbert. Dillon, he was a Brit. He got his first ZX Spectrum computer early 1980s. And not sure if it was the Yorkshire man or not, but he said that when you got one of these things, it didn't really come with any games, so you had to make the games yourself. So it was like, oh, you were lucky! We didn't have no games, we had to make our games ourselves! Or as it goes in the Monty Python thing, I don't do a good impression of that. But anyhow, there was this company here in the UK called Argonaut Software, and they made 3D games for just about anything. So they put 3D engines on everything. And Dillon, age 16, got hired to create a 3D engine on the Nintendo Game Boy. The only thing was that they did not have a development kit because Nintendo sort of made their own games. So the first thing he did was to create the hardware, to actually build software for this thing, and then set about creating a 3D engine. And we're talking about a 3D engine for a gaming device that was so slow that it couldn't redraw the entire screen in one go. It had to do it in 2 goes. But he managed, and it became the fairly unknown game called X for the Nintendo Game Boy. And Nintendo was so impressed with the work that he had done that he was flown over to Japan. and began working on a secret project to bring 3D graphics to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. And to do that, they had to create a special chip that went on the game cartridges that he popped in the machine that the games were on. And he created a mathematical Argonaut rotation and input-output chip, or Mario for short, that went on there. So a bit of homage to Nintendo there. And that was used for the original Star Fox game. So Star Fox and the 3D graphics on the Super Nintendo, we have a 17-year-old Brit to thank for that. And to make the even more incredible things, there was this games company back in Norway called Funcom. They're still about. And the Winter Olympics of 1994 were at Lillehammer, and they sort of created a game for that. Only they are notoriously well known for having delayed projects, so it took them until 1996 to get this out, where this game, Winter Gold, was released. Now, this might look fairly familiar to you all, and this is on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and it's using Dillon's Cuthbert's extra hardware, and it's using the 3D techniques that Paul Endre Anderson created. And he even has the dancing thing in there, and yes, it's his girlfriend still. But the thing is that this got quite a bit of attention, because this does not look like your regular 3D games at the time. And the reason for that is that this is actual video, so it's an on-rails video moving down, so the graphics were way better than what anyone had seen, and it was one on sort of very limited hardware at the time. So that's what you get when you combine British and Norwegian teenage engineering. So another teenager, United States again this time. This here is Jordan Magna. And Jordan Magna had one dream in his life, and he's actually achieved his life goal now, and that was getting a film produced by Hollywood. And that film is the Prince of Persia film, because Jordan Magna is the author of the Prince of Persia games. But when he wrote that game, he was in his early 20s. So we have to go a bit back to an unreleased game that he created when he was around 16 years old. Now, this is the game Deathbounds. Never got released properly, but it's a pity it wasn't, because this looks like a fun game. Looks a bit odd, but yeah. But one of the good things about Jordan Magna is that he kept meticulous journals about everything he did. So we get sort of an insight into what was going on in his teenage genius mind at the time he was making this game. And so it starts out February 1982, where he has read an article in Creative Computing magazine about how to generate random numbers. And that sparks an idea in his mind about a game he wants to create that's going to be called Deathbounds. And then he starts thinking about, okay, what if I sell 1,000 copies of this? I'll make that much money. But what if I sell 5,000 copies of this? And he sort of gets the motivation going for working on this. He starts writing the program, starts off using BASIC, which is the programming language Elon Musk was using at the start of this, and then realizes, no, that's not fast enough language. I need to teach myself how to do this in assembler. So he wipes everything he has, goes back, does that. Then he stumbles upon sort of these techniques that also people like John Carmack would discover later, on having two screens so that you avoid having flicker when you draw your game. So he sort of invents all of these things and writes it down in his journal. And all of that comes from him reading an article in Creative Computing magazine, this particular issue on graphics and animation, this piece of source code. And again, we see that distributing software in the 80s is by magazine. So print it on the page, type it in, and you get something. But one thing I find particularly interesting is that him as a 16-year-old in his bedroom creating this Deathbounds game is quite like the projects we do when we build enterprise software and all that, because it has a to-do list in there. It's sort of a project plan, and that is to finish the game and clean up the code. Then test, 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 test. And then just do all of the missing things, all of the remaining features, and then get it out there. So software was created in just the same way back then as it is now. This is Chris Madera. Not yet a teenager at the time this was filmed. He was 11 years old, and this is a game he created for the iPad. That got a bit of attention a few years back. He was invited to do a TED Talk, which you're seeing down in the left-hand side corner. I wasn't able to find much of his source code, but there's some about. This is some Swift code he has up on GitHub. But I think one of the things is sort of hello world, but it's hello world get destroyed. And it says something about sort of the drive these kids have. And that sort of got me thinking. Because I saw a report called the 2018 Hacker Skills Report, which is really about people in the IT industry and when they started learning programming and so forth. And sort of millennials coming into IT during the last few years started out programming when they were at age between 16 and 20, most of them. Whereas the people my age, sort of from mid-30s to early 40s, who've been in the industry for a while, most of those people first got introduced to programming between the ages of 5 and 10. So that surprised me quite a bit, because I would have thought it to be the other way around, that technology is way more available these days and so forth, but it turned out it wasn't. And I think it has much to do with when you get a computer these days, it comes with everything. So you don't have to start it up, and you don't see sort of your Microsoft Advanced Basic as the first thing that greets you, and you have to figure out how do you use this thing, and then type this off that page in the magazine, and you sort of learn programming through that. Everything is there. So you don't really get to see what's inside and what's behind there, and someone has to show you. And it's our responsibility as an industry to actually inspire kids to go on exploring and get curious about what's inside the computer. Because that's the other thing, that most of these stories are from sort of the 80s, 90s. There aren't that many good stories about kids teaching themselves how to use computers these days and then go on to do these marvelous things. So at some point that stopped. And the other thing is that it's all boys. It's all boys. The only girls in these presentations are the ones dancing. And I think that's a bit, I would have liked it to be different. And that has to do with sometime, so whatever sparked this, it was computers at home, then suddenly computers became a boys' thing. Because before that, it was mostly women in the IT industry. So things changed. And if someone's going to change that back again, it's us. So I just challenge you to do that. And I want to take you to the United States late 60s and Lakeside High. And the mothers at Lakeside High had petitioned their school to create a computer lab. Because they've seen that computers were starting to mean something and make an impact on the world. So they had bake sales to finance this and so on. And finally the school got a computer. And there were 2 boys at this school who were absolutely mesmerized by that computer. So they spent every moment they had in the computer room at the school. They even went on and broke into the school at night time to get to use the computer more. As you do when you are young and do something Improper, you get caught. They were expelled from school, barred from using the computer lab, which was a tragedy, until the headmaster realized that I have a problem. So every single summer, I have 2 people working all the way through the summer to set up the schedule for the next semester. So I'll give these 2 boys a challenge. I'll challenge them to write software on the computer to actually solve that for me. And they were there every single day, worked day and night through the summer, and they managed to solve the problem. They also managed to sneak in an Easter egg, so the younger of the 2 could sit next to a girl he was a bit fond of in every single class they had together. And those 2 were Paul Allen and Bill Gates, and that was the start of Microsoft. And the rest of that is history. And I think that just goes to show how far you can get with a bit of good teenage engineering and making it possible for kids to actually unleash their potential. So this has been the marvels of teenage engineering. We do have 8 minutes left, so yes, we can talk about the colors if you want to stick around and listen to me talking about colors. Otherwise, thank you for showing up. So yes, the Atari ST was able to show 16 colors at the time of a total palette of 512 colors. So, but the game, Enchanted Lands, has 4,096 colors in the palette, and it has quite a few of them on the screen at the same time. So there are a couple of things going on here. One thing is the technique that Nicholas already knew, that he kept track of where on his screen his execution pointer was. So since he knew how it was moving down the screen drawing things, he could change the colors that were shown on every single line. So he could replace the entire 16 color palette every single line down the screen. And the other thing it did was that he interpolated between 2 close colors to create the shade in between. So he flashed them sort of 50 times a second to create more than the 512 colors he had available. Now, these were not techniques he invented himself. These had been around for a while from other kids working on their Commodore 64 computers, doing similar things earlier in the 1980s. So that's how that was done. So any other questions? We do have 6 minutes left. Yeah, this one there. So he did not enjoy this talk because he feels stupid, and that happens. You're not the first one to say that. It's like I was thinking about this. I was hoping this would be an inspiring talk, and I hope it is to some of you. But it goes. It's like these kids were 16 years old and they did these things. It's like, and where have I gotten with my life? Probably done something else. But what you might have done is that you haven't spent all of your youth in your bedroom programming your computer in assembly language. And there are other things to experience as a teenager. So it's not all good. Yes.
Yeah, just obviously, it's fantastic. There's a load of kids doing this, and like you say, there's a lack of them today. And I don't know whether it's down to inspiration or it's just down to the fact like they're not as curious anymore with it because everything's there already, like you kind of said. I don't know, you've got any other take on that as to why it's kind of dropped off?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the question was, why has this dropped off and our kids not as curious as they used to be? Luckily, we have started introducing programming in schools recently. That hasn't been the case for a while. And I know that is quite popular. Kids have been taught the Scratch programming language, which is really... It's a fairly rich language for it being as simple as it is. And you have all of these toys coming out now that are impossible to get hold of because of COVID and then the container crisis and nothing coming out of China, but where you actually get to piece things together by hand and program that way. So things are becoming more available, and I am seeing a trend that people are getting more curious. So let's just hope that curiosity goes on to them making interesting things, as we've just seen as well. And to be fair, there are some kids doing great stuff these days as well. So Minecraft, a very interesting example. I did this talk at NDC London earlier this week, and after the talk there was one coming over that told me that Roblox, yeah, but what was the story? There was a kid at his son's school, I think, that had taught himself to program Java to create sort of a rainbow hammer for Minecraft that he was now making money from selling. And he was like 13 years old or something like that. So there are some stories. I need to find the source code for that so I can show it off. So yeah, we have 3 minutes left. Do you have any teenage engineering stories of your own you would like to share with the rest of us? No, that's all right. Okay, I think I'll let you guys go early. Thank you for coming. It has been a pleasure being here talking to you.